Hi guy, welcome back TV Spoilers. Young and the Restless Spoilers. Abby didn't just lose her composure when Dominic Winters disappeared. She felt as if she'd been dragged straight to the edge of a dark drop she couldn't even name. Dominic had become the one steady center that kept Abby's life shaped like a home. Like a future she and Devon had fought to build through fractures. They never fully admitted out loud. But the moment Dominic wasn't there, when the house suddenly felt empty in a way that wasn't normal, Abby realized real fear doesn't come from silence itself. It comes from the meaning inside that silence, from the possibility that it isn't accidental at all. Someone had taken her son, and they had done it cleanly enough to erase the scene. As if Dominic had never been in this exact stretch of time. Abby's panic wasn't weakness, it was the mother in her igniting like a firestorm, burning through every remaining layer of reason she usually prided herself on keeping intact. At first, Abby still tried to cling to the smallest thread of comfort and almost childish hope that Dominic had simply wandered, that he was only out of sight. That the adult's anxiety had inflated a momentary lapse into catastrophe. But that hope shattered the more she stared at the details and saw they didn't fit. There were no little footsteps, no signs of a harmless game, no evidence of playing at all. It felt like a cold incision through her life. Dominic was gone. And the world kept moving with brutal normalcy. Abby's heartbeat turned into a pounding accusation. She replayed the last hours in her mind, stretching memory like a torn wound. Forcing herself to face the question she hated most, whether she'd been careless. Whether she believed she was safe simply because Genoa City had trained everyone to live beside disaster. Abby wouldn't let herself sit. She moved through the house as if searching for an exit from her own body, hands trembling, breathing too sharp, eyes sweeping corners as though Dominic might reappear if she stared hard enough. Devon was there, but even his presence couldn't soothe her. Abby needed an answer, a concrete sign, a piece of certainty to grab onto. While Devon loved both Abby and Dominic, kept a measure of calm, as if he were trying to become the ground beneath both of them. Sometimes that steadiness hurt her more, not because she blamed him, but because it made her feel alone inside the storm. Abby looked at Devon not to attack him, but to demand confirmation that she wasn't exaggerating, that the dread tightening her throat was real. Devon tried to anchor her with resolve, but Abby no longer had patience for gentle promises. Every second felt like another step Dominic was being pulled farther away. Another opportunity for whoever had done this to erase more evidence. Abby didn't need comfort, she needed action, speed. Control, the very things this situation was stripping from her. Her worry intensified with every passing minute. And it wasn't the ordinary fear of a parent who lost sight of a child for a moment. It carried the taste of a primal alarm. The kind that only rises when danger is real, when some unseen force is moving just beyond the curtain. Abby and Devon began to understand this couldn't be Dominic playing a game with them. Because a child couldn't vanish from a familiar area without leaving any trace at all. Abby clung to that realization like a rope, but it didn't rescue her. It pulled her deeper into the most terrifying conclusion: someone had intervened. And once Abby accepted that, she was forced to accept the next possibility, to that the purpose behind it wasn't harmless. No one in the area had seen Dominic. The sentence was simple, and it was cruel. It repeated in Abby's mind like a hammer against bone. No one saw him meant no one knew. No one knew meant no one could help. Abby felt as though she were standing inside a circle of people who all turned away. Not out of indifference, but because they truly had nothing to offer. The lack of information made her feel unhinged. She wanted direction, a clue, anything. Instead, she met shaking heads, sympathetic eyes, half answers that only widened the emptiness. The more uncertainty she collected, the tighter her chest became. In Genoa City, Abby had witnessed too many disappearances that never returned to normal. Too many lives swallowed by plots that left behind only press conferences, apologies, and framed photographs on mantels. Abby couldn't let Dominic become one more name inside that pattern. As dusk fell, the changing light outside was what finally broke Abby's last instinct to self-soothe. Sunset might look peaceful to someone else, to Abby it felt like a door slowly closing, trapping her inside the helplessness of night. She told Devon with raw desperation that she feared the darkness. Because darkness hides movement, cars, footsteps, shifting shadows. Darkness makes the worst people bolder. Abby didn't need anyone to remind her that Dominic could be cold, hungry, frightened. Her imagination was already drowning her in those images. She hated herself for picturing them, but she couldn't stop. Each thought was a needle she couldn't pull out, and the more she tried to fight it, the deeper it lodged. Devon promised they would find Dominic. The promise came from love and from survival because if Devon didn't hold steady, Abby would collapse completely. But Devon couldn't deny what was closing in around them. Something about this was wrong. The wrongness wasn't only that Dominic was missing, it was the way everything felt too clean, too carefully emptied. Devon understood that if they kept running in circles on their own, they were giving time to someone who had planned this, and was using that time to stay ahead. And Abby, even burning with emotion, could feel the truth inside that logic. There are situations love alone can't solve. She hated the thought of calling the police, hated the idea of turning private terror into a public file, hated the scrutiny, the gossip, the inevitable judgment. But she hated losing minutes more. So the question wasn't whether they should call the police. The question became why they hadn't already. Inside Abby lived a stubborn pride. The part of her that was used to controlling crises with her own hands. That part fought the idea of asking for help. Abby had weathered family wars, betrayals, secrets. And she usually chose to hide her fear where no one could witness it. But Dominic wasn't a corporate battle or a psychological game or a scandal she could maneuver around. Dominic was flesh and blood. And when flesh and blood is taken, pride becomes meaningless. Abby hated admitting she was powerless. Yet she also understood that powerlessness wasn't a flaw, it was reality. And reality demanded she break her usual patterns if she wanted her son back. That was when the shadow of the dramatic shooting revelation began to press in on her, like another blade sliding silently against her ribs. It didn't feel separate from Dominic's disappearance, it felt like an echo from recent days. A warning that danger was multiplying around her in ways she couldn't predict. The truth about the shooting, though Abby couldn't fully name it, yething above her like toxic weather. Abby's deepest fear wasn't only that Dominic was gone. It was that everything would be stitched together in the most merciless way. That this chaos would push her into a legal dead end, into suspicion. Into the nightmare of being painted as a murderer when she was simply a mother. Being robbed of the one thing she couldn't live without. Abby felt the world preparing to turn her into the villain of her own story. And the thought made her both terrified and furious at fate's cruelty. Furious at danger she didn't create yet would be forced to pay for. Furious that someone might be arranging a trap designed to crush her from multiple sides at once. That pressure made Abby more volatile than she'd ever been. The fear for Dominic left no room for the careful logic she usually relied on. She began to suspect everything: neighborhood silence, the gaps in the timeline, even the way people looked at her. Abby knew that in Genoa City, tragedy rarely stands alone. It drags consequences behind it. It attracts factions. It invites invisible hands to shape truth into whatever benefits them. Abby didn't want this to become a war with the world. But she couldn't stop herself from imagining the chain reaction. Dominic missing leads to police involvement. Police involvement leads to investigation. Investigation leads to exposure. And exposure leads to Abby's life being put under a microscope. And if one detail was misunderstood or twisted, Abby wouldn't just lose Dominic, she could lose her freedom, her dignity, her right to be his mother. That fear lodged in her throat like a stone, then turned into a rage that threatened to erupt. Devon watched Abby in brief, strained silences, knowing she was crossing the edge of what a person can endure. He didn't want her drowning in irrational guilt, blaming herself for Dominic's disappearance. But Devon also couldn't ignore how quickly this could spiral into a public nightmare. He began to suspect something unusual too, not only because Dominic was missing, but because danger felt like a fog settling over them, thick and deliberate. Devon didn't want Abby carrying the additional weight of the shooting revelation. Yet he knew Genoa City was the kind of place where a terrible story can escalate overnight. And looking at Abby, Devon saw one truth clearly: if Dominic wasn't found soon, Abby wouldn't just lose control, she would lose herself. Night fell fully, and the darkness wasn't only outside the windows. It moved into Abby, sharpening every thought into something jagged. She tried to hold onto Devon, onto his promise, onto the next action they were about to take. But panic kept flooding back. She wanted to believe Dominic would be brought home safely. Yet she was haunted by the possibility that someone was prolonging this on purpose. Waiting for Abby to react the wrong way. Waiting for her desperation to become the very thing used against her. Abby felt as though a rope was tightening around her throat, a rope called dead end. And the words murder charge stood like a ghost at the end of the corridor, ready to swallow her the moment she took one step in the wrong direction. Abby didn't want to become a victim of a story she didn't write. But she couldn't stop trembling at the thought that her panic, her human, maternal panic, would be recorded, interpreted, and transformed into evidence. When Devon finally leaned into calling the police, it wasn't coldness, it was survival. And Abby, in that moment, felt both relief because at last there was a straight path forward, and a new chill. Because she understood that once the police were involved, everything would move beyond their control. Abby would have to answer questions. She would have to reconstruct time. She would face eyes measuring her grief and deciding whether it looked reasonable. Abby hated that, but Dominic mattered more than anything. Still, the fear linked to the shooting revelation remained in her like heated metal. Abby worried that once the door of investigation opened, other truths would rush in with it, and she would be dragged into a whirlpool of overlapping suspicion. The more Abby thought about it, the more everything began to resemble a multi-layered trap. And Dominic was the most painful bait. Abby didn't want to believe anyone could be that cruel. But she also wasn't naive enough to trust coincidence. She started to wonder about purpose, to drive her into hysteria, to fracture her partnership, to make her act without control so she could be labeled unstable, to force a mistake that would lock her inside a murder accusation. Abby understood something that made her blood run cold. Some schemes don't require you to do something evil. They only require you to react like a desperate human being. Then let your reaction be turned into the weapon. Abby hated the way life in Genoa City worked like that, where private suffering is never allowed to remain private, where tragedy is always someone's leverage. Yet even as she hated it, she couldn't stop seeing everything through suspicion. Because suspicion had become her instinct for survival. Her anxiety didn't lessen as the decision to call the police formed. It simply rearranged itself into a more structured tension. Abby began forcing herself to remember, slicing the timeline into smaller pieces, scanning for gaps, for anything that might be misread later. She was a mother and an unwilling witness to her own catastrophe. She knew that any inconsistency, any answer too emotional, could be treated as a red flag. The idea broke her in a quiet way, because it demanded that she perform composure while she was collapsing internally. Abby felt as though she were living two lives at once. One where she was a mother searching for her missing child, and another where she was bracing for the possibility of being dragged into a murder case. Because the shooting revelation would surface at the worst possible time. That collision of realities stole her breath. Devon did what he could to keep Abby from sliding into self-destructs. He couldn't carry her pain, but he could stand close enough that she didn't fall alone. He also began to suspect something wasn't right again, not only because Dominic was missing, but because the sense of threat was pressing in with an eerie intention. Devon knew Abby was stretched between love and fear, between the need to find Dominic and the fear of being framed by circumstances. Devon wanted to spare her that, but he couldn't deny the nature of their city, a place where truth can be molded before it can be proven. As the phone was lifted, as the choice to call the police became imminent, Abby suddenly felt as if she were standing before two doors opening at once. One door led toward the hope of finding Dominic. The other opened into an endless corridor of questions and accusations that could destroy her. If the shooting was pulled into the light in the most damaging way, Abby didn't know which door she would step through first or whether they were the same door, leading into the same tunnel. But she knew this, from the moment the call connected, people wouldn't only ask, "Where is Dominic?" They would start asking, "What is Abby hiding?" And that shift, that brutal pivot, was what frightened her down to her bones. And just as Devon was about to dial, just as Abby forced herself to breathe so she wouldn't collapse right there, a cold thought sliced through her like lightning. If whoever is behind this wants to drive her into a dead end with a murder charge, then Dominic isn't only a victim, Dominic is leverage. Abby understood it a heartbeat too late. And in the next breath she could only wonder before the call even began whether the police would arrive to help her find her child, or to place her at the top of the suspect list. And when the questions about the shooting started, whether Abby would still have enough control left to save Dominic, or whether her terror would become the evidence that turns everything against her. Mariah had already gone too far to keep convincing herself this was just a brief lapse, a reckless impulse she could undo once the panic passed. The moment she placed Dominic at the center of her escape plan, everything became a tunnel with only one direction forward. The farther she walked, the darker it felt, and the darker it felt, the more she believed there was no other choice. In Genoa City, tragedies often begin with small details and harmless-sounding self-justifications. But Mariah's descent carried a different rhythm. It wasn't an explosion, it was a slow leak, seeping into each decision. Each second she looked at Dominic and then at her own reflection, and no longer recognized the woman staring back. She was no longer acting like someone with agency. She was reacting like someone trapped inside a script written by fear, obsession, and a hallucination so persistent it disguised itself as reason in her mind. What is most frightening isn't only that Mariah chose to kidnap Dominic, but that she began to view the act as a solution instead of a crime. When someone has been unsteady for long enough, the line between salvation and destruction blurs. All they can see is the sensation of being forced into a corner. Mariah believed that if she stayed, she would be dragged into the light, exposed, swallowed by questions she didn't have the strength to answer. She believed that if she stayed, People would take Dominic from her in the most brutal way under the banner of law, under the banner of safety, under the banner of the child's best interests while inside her. She could hear only one sound: collapse. And so, in Mariah's thinking, leaving stopped being a choice and became a survival reflex. She didn't say it out loud, had no one to say it to. And perhaps she wasn't even brave enough to admit that she was turning a child into her last life raft. For Mariah, Dominic wasn't merely a child. In her unraveling state, he became the symbol of the purity she feared losing. The proof that she once had a role, a place to belong, a reason to be trusted. When that sense of trust fractured inside her, when nights became crowded with invisible noise, and moments of disorientation made her doubt her own senses, Dominic became the only thing that could pull her away from the belief that she was useless, dangerous, a risk to everyone she loved. And here is where the tragedy turns cruel, because Mariah wanted to hold onto the feeling that she could still love and protect. She chose an action that made Dominic the one most harmed. In her mind, she didn't call it kidnapping. She called it taking Dominic somewhere safe, somewhere no one could reach them, somewhere the judging stares and suffocating panic couldn't follow. But that safety was really a locked box, and the first person trapped inside it would be Dominic. Ian Ward continued in her hallucinations to function as the shadow, whispering the worst possible advice into Mariah's ear. The horror was that Mariah didn't merely hear him, she believed him. Ian's presence didn't feel like an ordinary memory. It felt like a speaking silhouette, an idea wearing a human shape, clinging to Mariah in her weakest, most exhausted moments. When persuasion required almost no force, Ian didn't need power, he only needed to supply what Mariah lacked most: certainty. When a chaotic mind meets a confident voice, that voice is easily mistaken for truth. Mariah had reached a state where any guidance could become a compass, and Ian appeared as the guide, pointing into darkness while calling it escape. Each time Mariah hesitated, each time she looked at Dominic and felt the sharp stab of conscience, Ian returned as a figure who seemed to know her better than anyone, as if to insist she wasn't allowed to soften, as if to suggest turning back would mean being crushed. Mariah wasn't only facing hallucinations, she was facing the erosion of her ability to recognize them as hallucinations. That is the most dangerous threshold. When someone still knows they're wrong, they still have a chance to stop. But Mariah was sliding into the place where she began to treat Ian as part of her inner reality, an inseparable companion that made every terrible suggestion feel logical in the most terrifying way. Ian pushed her to go farther, quieter, more absolute. Because he understood Mariah's weakness with perfect accuracy, she feared being found, feared being caught, feared being dragged back to face the truth. And when fear becomes the engine, cruelty can masquerade as determination. Mariah told herself that once she reached that place, once she vanished cleanly enough, everything would settle. But what she imagined wasn't peace, it was total silence. A silence where she didn't have to hear anyone except Ian inside her head. The closer Mariah came to leaving, the more she entered a state with no return, it only because she had committed something unforgivable, but because her mind had built a maze to protect the decision itself. If Mariah stopped, if she turned back, the entire defensive structure inside her would collapse, releasing guilt and horror she didn't believe she could survive. So instead of stopping, she surged forward. And the farther she went, the more she needed to believe she was right. Because the mind has a ruthless mechanism. When we do something wrong, we often defend it more fiercely to avoid facing the fact that it is wrong. Mariah was living inside that mechanism, a loop Ian kept feeding with honeyed words that tasted like poison. She was preparing to take Dominic somewhere they would never be found. And the meaning of that choice made the air feel unbreathable. It wasn't just running, it was severing. It was disappearing from the map of everyone who loved Dominic Severion, who would be driven mad by losing a son, a grandson, a piece of their heart. Mariah may not have spoken it aloud, but somewhere deep inside, she knew that making Dominic vanish would create a wound that could never fully close for those left behind. And yet she still moved forward, because at this point, other people's pain had become distant background noise, while her own panic was the only sound blaring at full volume. That is one of the clearest signs of a mind in crisis. The world shrinks until only one fear and one objective remain, and everything else becomes scenery. There was also a cold truth Mariah couldn't bear to name: Dominic couldn't consent or resist the way an adult could. A child's silence is easy for an adult to interpret however they want. Mariah could look at Dominic and tell herself he was fine, that he was okay, that he only needed to stay with her. But Dominic had no language to describe what was happening. And that lack of language made Mariah's actions even more frightening. This tragedy didn't require screaming. It only required a child carried away into the night and a woman convincing herself she was doing the right thing. In the hallucination, Ian didn't even need to sound threatening. Sometimes cruelty travels best in the voice of reason. He could make Mariah believe everyone would betray her, that everyone would take Dominic away, that the world outside held only punishment. And once Mariah believed that, she would automatically choose the most extreme option, disappear. The painful part is that Mariah isn't a simple villain. She is unstable, splintering, losing the ability to distinguish protection from possession. That complexity makes the story more disturbing than straightforward evil, because it shows something painfully human collapsing into something inexcusable. The tension around Mariah didn't come only from the risk of being caught. It came from an internal battle she was steadily losing. Each time Mariah looked at Dominic, there may have been a brief moment when her conscience stirred, when she felt the wrongness of dragging a child into her desperate flight. But then Ian returned like a nail hammered through that moment of regret, pinning it down so it couldn't grow into action. Mariah began to treat remorse as danger, as weakness that would slow her down. And slowing down meant being caught. So she learned to mute the human part of herself, to move like a shadow, to treat emotion as a luxury she could not afford. As for motive, Mariah wasn't chasing money, status, or victory. What she wanted was relief from the sensation of being hunted by her own mind. Dominic became the wrong key she used to open that door. This is a particularly dangerous kind of desperation, not greed, but the need to silence pain. People will do the cruelest things simply to avoid feeling like they're falling apart. Mariah might believe she was saving Dominic from an unsafe world, but in truth she was trying to save herself from an internal world that had spun out of control. She pulled Dominic into that storm the way a drowning person clutches another body, just to stay afloat even though it means the other person will struggle to breathe too. In Genoa City, some people believe they can handle everything alone, that if they're fast enough, quiet enough, ruthless enough, they can outrun consequences. Mariah clung to that illusion. But the harder she tried to control, the more she revealed the opposite truth. She controlled nothing anymore. She didn't control the hallucinations. She didn't control the fear. She didn't control the way Ian was driving her deeper. She controlled only one thing still within her reach: Dominic. And that is why Dominic became the center of this tragedy. When someone can control only one thing, they grip it so tightly they can suffocate it. The sense of no return grew sharper as Mariah began cutting the last threads that tied her to ordinary life. She didn't have to say it aloud. In her mind, it was already done. She had placed a period at the end of the possibility of going back. She had assigned herself a new identity, the person who disappears. And once someone fuses their identity with disappearance, they will do anything to protect it. Because being dragged back into the light would mean facing the collapse of the self they're using to survive. Mariah's instability was both fragile and volatile. Fragile because one small change, a sign of being discovered, an unexpected sound, could make her fall apart. Volatile because in panic she could make an even more extreme decision to solve the threat. Ian, even as a hallucination, strengthened that volatility. He didn't allow her to think slowly. He pushed the belief that hesitation equals death, that softness equals destruction. When someone absorbs that message long enough, they start to mistake cruelty for strength. Mariah might feel powerful because she is doing what others would never dare. But it is a hollow strength built out of panic. If you look closely, there is a deep sadness inside this story. Mariah once understood the value of family, trust, the fragile bonds people offer each other. And because she understood it, her fall is even more devastating. It's like a house that was built carefully, filled with windows and light, then shifted and cracked by storms until it collapsed, not from one loud blast, but from fractures that were ignored for too long. Ian, as a ghost, only has to press lightly on those fractures and everything gives way. That doesn't make Mariah forgivable, but it makes the tragedy heavier. You can see a person self-destructing and in the process, dragging an innocent child with her. As Mariah neared the moment of leaving, she grew quieter, less expressive, as though she were gathering all her energy just to keep from shattering. But this silence wasn't peace. It was the silence of someone running inside her own head. And in that silence, Ian became louder. There were moments when Mariah felt a false sense of rightness, as if Ian were helping her organize everything. That false rightness is dangerous because it suits confusion just enough to keep her moving. People often think hallucinations are pure chaos, but sometimes hallucinations provide structure, because they offer answers when reality is too complicated to face. Mariah clung to that counterfeit structure like a railing in a pitch-black stairwell. No return also meant that anyone trying to pull Mariah back would be seen as an enemy. That is the most terrifying effect of a mind being led. It interprets rescue as attack. Mariah no longer believed anyone wanted to help her. She believed they wanted to take Dominic, punish her, tear away the last thing she had. Trust had inverted. And when trust dies, every bridge burns. Mariah stood on the far side of those bridges with Dominic in her arms, listening to Ian like he was the last remaining guide, believing that disappearing was the only way to exist. What makes this story tighten in the viewer's chest isn't only the suspense it's how it touches something painfully real. The fear that people can convince themselves to do the wrong thing in the name of love. And the fear that when the mind is wounded, moral boundaries can bend until we don't even realize we've crossed them. Mariah isn't a simple villain, she is a storm. And inside that storm, Dominic is like a leaf dragged along. Thinking about that makes me feel both angry and heartsick. Because I understand how instability can distort a person. And yet I can't accept that a child should pay the price of that distortion. Part of me wants to believe that if Mariah paused for 1 second, if she heard her own conscience, instead of Ian's voice, everything could change. But the deeper I sit with the situation, the colder it feels. Sometimes the most horrifying thing isn't deliberate evil, but a mistake grown large by desperation, guided by hallucination, until it becomes a choice with no way back. And because there is no way back, the moment Mariah prepares to take Dominic to a place where no one will ever find them isn't merely an escape, it's a point of no return, a wound carved into everyone who remains behind. I end here with a heaviness in my chest, the kind that makes you ask if Ian keeps whispering inside Mariah's mind, if she keeps mistaking the worst advice for salvation. Will the next moment be the moment she vanishes and everyone begins a frantic search? Or will it be the moment Mariah, in a rare flash of clarity, realizes she has crossed the final line and no longer knows how to come back? On our TV Spoilers channel, I always seek content inspiration for each video by compiling short video clips to analyze and offer my personal opinions. This channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in the Young and the Restless series from the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective, and more interesting perspectives. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about the Young and the Restless series.